When tech mogul Bradley Harrison stepped off his private jet in Monaco that crisp October evening, adjusting his Tom Ford tuxedo and checking his Patek Philippe, he had no idea that the next 60 minutes would shatter everything he believed about power, success, and the woman he'd thrown away like yesterday's stock options. The Monaco Billionaires Gala. The most exclusive gathering of global elite on the planet. Bradley had spent weeks preparing for this moment, this debut of his new life with Anastasia Volkov draped on his arm like the perfect accessory. Russian supermodel, 23 years old, blonde hair that caught light like spun gold, and blue eyes that photographed beautifully for business magazines. Everything his world expected. Everything that made sense. But as their Bentley pulled up to the waterfront venue, as camera flashes exploded around them and Anastasia's nervous smile wavered slightly, Bradley had no way of knowing that in exactly 47 minutes, he would be standing behind a velvet rope, watching his ex-wife, the black woman he'd divorced 2 years earlier, glide through the Billionaire's VIP section on the arm of a man whose net worth made Bradley's fortune look like lunch money. He had no way of knowing that Keisha Williams Harrison, the woman he'd once patronized and ultimately discarded, had become something he could never be, authentically powerful. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor about racial hierarchies and the men who built their empires on the backs of brilliant women they never truly saw. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story, this reckoning, began long before Monaco in the sterile conference rooms of Silicon Valley, where brilliant black women are invited to speak about diversity but rarely invited to own the companies. Comment where you're watching from because this story about love, betrayal, and the ultimate reversal of fortune will leave you questioning everything you think you know about success and revenge. And if you've ever been underestimated because of who you are, your race, your background, your gender, you need to hear this. Bradley Michael Harrison III was born into the kind of wealth that whispers instead of shouts. Third-generation tech money, Stanford MBA, the kind of man whose grandfather's name appeared on university buildings and whose father's connections opened doors before Bradley even knew they existed. His childhood was Marin County estates, summers in the Hamptons, winters in Aspen. A world so white, so insulated, that diversity meant having friends whose families owned vineyards in different countries. At 35, Bradley possessed the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. 6'2", silver-touch temples that suggested wisdom, and the kind of expensive dental work that created perfect camera-ready smiles. His company, Harrison Tech Solutions, had grown from his father's connections and his own undeniable intelligence into a mid-tier player in enterprise software. Respectable. Profitable. The kind of success that guaranteed country club membership and invitations to charity galas where tax-deductible donations bought social access. But Bradley's comfort zone was about to be challenged by a woman whose brilliance had been forged in spaces where failure meant more than just disappointment. It meant proving every stereotype right. Keisha Denise Williams grew up in Detroit, where her father assembled cars on the Ford line and her mother worked double shifts as a registered nurse. Their modest brick home sat in a neighborhood where excellence wasn't just personal achievement, it was community survival. Keisha learned early that being twice as good meant you might get half the recognition, but that didn't mean you stopped trying. It meant you got creative. Full scholarship to Northwestern for computer science. Graduated summa cum laude. Wharton MBA with a concentration in strategic management, because Keisha understood that knowing how to code wasn't enough. You had to understand how power moved through organizations, how decisions were made, and most importantly, how to position yourself so that your voice carried weight in rooms where you'd never been welcome. At 32, Keisha was 5'7" of controlled elegance, with natural hair she wore in styles that commanded respect, warm brown skin that required no enhancement, and the kind of intellectual intensity that made men like Bradley simultaneously attracted and intimidated. She'd spent her career navigating predominantly white corporate spaces, translating her ideas into language that wouldn't threaten fragile egos, and building bridges between cultures that many of her colleagues didn't even realize were different. Her consulting firm, Strategic Cultural Solutions, specialized in helping companies authentically reach diverse markets. Not the performative diversity that looked good in annual reports, but the deep cultural intelligence that turned missed opportunities into sustainable revenue streams. Keisha understood something that most of Silicon Valley's leaders never learned. Culture wasn't just about optics. It was about understanding how different communities made decisions, built trust, and spent money. She was brilliant, ambitious, and tired of being the only black face in conference rooms where her expertise was simultaneously valued and subtly dismissed. The Tech Forward Conference in San Francisco, March 2021. Keisha was the keynote speaker for a panel on authentic diversity in market expansion. Bradley was there because his company needed to appear progressive for a series of upcoming investor meetings. He'd attended dozens of these panels before, usually checking his phone through presentations that felt more like corporate theater than actual strategy. But when Keisha took the stage, something shifted. She didn't just recite statistics about demographic spending power. She dissected case studies where companies had failed spectacularly by treating Black and Latino consumers as afterthoughts, then rebuilt those same strategies using cultural intelligence that turned those failures into multimillion-dollar success stories. Diversity isn't charity, Keisha said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. It's a competitive advantage. And if you're still thinking about it as charity, you're about to get outmaneuvered by someone who understands that culture drives commerce. Bradley found himself actually paying attention. Not just to her words, but to the way she commanded the space, the way she answered questions with a depth that made other speakers seem superficial by comparison. When some tech bro in the audience tried to challenge her with a poorly disguised racist question about cultural authenticity, Keisha dismantled his assumptions so gracefully that even he applauded when she finished. After her presentation, Bradley approached her at the networking reception. Not because he needed diversity consulting, or so he told himself, but because he was genuinely intrigued by someone who could make him rethink assumptions he didn't even know he held. "Your presentation was incredible," Bradley said, extending his hand. "Bradley Harrison, Harrison Tech Solutions. I'd love to discuss how someone with your expertise might help us expand into markets we've been missing." Keisha studied him for a moment. She'd received variations of this approach before. White executives who were impressed by her competence and wanted to harness it for their benefit. But something in Bradley's expression seemed different. Less predatory. More genuinely curious. "What markets are you missing?" she asked. "Honestly? Probably all of them outside of upper-middle-class white demographics," Bradley admitted. "We're good at what we do, but I'm starting to realize we might be leaving money on the table because we don't understand how other communities make purchasing decisions." It was an honest answer. More honest than Keisha usually heard from executives who wanted to appear woke without doing the work of actually becoming culturally competent. "Tell me about your last product launch," she said. For the next 30 minutes, Bradley found himself in the most intellectually stimulating conversation he'd had in months. Keisha didn't just listen to his description of their latest enterprise software rollout. She asked questions that revealed blind spots he hadn't even considered. Why had they only tested with focus groups from their existing customer base? What assumptions were they making about how different communities approach technology adoption? How were they measuring success beyond their traditional metrics? By the time the reception ended, Bradley knew two things. His company needed Keisha's expertise, and he was attracted to her in a way that had nothing to do with business. If you've ever been the only one in a room full of privilege, hit that subscribe button because this story gets so much deeper. 6 months of professional consultation became 6 months of personal fascination. Bradley hired Strategic Cultural Solutions for a comprehensive market expansion analysis, giving him legitimate reasons to schedule weekly meetings with Keisha. What started as business dinners evolved into long conversations about everything except business. Art, travel, politics, family, dreams. Keisha found herself genuinely surprised by Bradley's willingness to listen. Unlike other wealthy white men she'd encountered professionally, he didn't mansplain her own expertise back to her. He asked questions that suggested he was actually processing what she said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. When she talked about growing up in Detroit, he didn't offer poverty tourism sympathy or make assumptions about her background. He seemed genuinely curious about her perspective without treating her like an anthropological specimen. "I've been thinking about what you said about cultural bridges," Bradley said during a dinner at Gary Danko, the kind of restaurant where reservations required connections. "About how true diversity means understanding that different communities aren't just variations of your existing customer base, they're entirely different ecosystems with their own values and decision-making processes. Most executives stop listening after the different demographics have different spending power." Slide, Keisha replied, surprised by his engagement with concepts that usually glazed over white corporate eyes. "Because most executives are idiots who think culture is about focus group feedback and ethnic food at company potlucks," Bradley said. "You're talking about fundamental shifts in how we understand human behavior. That's incredibly attractive." The admission hung in the air between them. Professional boundaries blurring into personal attraction. "Bradley," Keisha said carefully, "I should probably mention that I don't typically date clients." "Then it's a good thing our contract ends next week," Bradley replied, his smile suggesting this transition had been planned longer than he was admitting. Their first real date was a private cooking class in Napa Valley. Bradley's choice, but he'd researched instructors until he found Chef Maria Santos, whose fusion approach honored both Mexican and French culinary traditions. He was learning, Keisha realized, to think about culture as something to be respected rather than simply consumed. "Why does this matter to you?" Keisha asked as they practiced knife techniques under Chef Santos' patient guidance. "Really?" Bradley paused, considering his answer while julienning vegetables with surgical precision. "I think I've spent my whole life in rooms where everyone looked like me, thought like me, and wanted the same things I wanted," he said. "It was comfortable, but it was also limited. You make me see possibilities I didn't even know existed. Not just in business but in everything." It was the right answer. More importantly, it felt genuine. Their courtship was a careful dance of cultural education and growing intimacy. Bradley introduced Keisha to his world: private wine tastings, exclusive gallery openings, charity galas where her presence was noted and mostly welcomed. Keisha introduced Bradley to hers: family dinners in Detroit where her father grilled him about his intentions and her mother fed him until he couldn't move, community events where his wealth meant nothing and his willingness to listen meant everything. "Your family is incredible," Bradley said during the drive back to San Francisco after a long weekend in Detroit. "The way they protect each other, support each other, it's beautiful." "It's necessary," Keisha replied. "When the world doesn't automatically give you the benefit of the doubt, family becomes everything." "I want to be part of that," Bradley said quietly. "Not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who understands what that kind of loyalty means." 18 months later, Bradley proposed at the Museum of African Diaspora during a private viewing of an exhibition Keisha had been excited to see. He'd arranged for the proposal to happen in front of Kehind Wiley's portrait series, art that celebrated Black excellence and beauty in spaces traditionally reserved for European masters. "I love you," Bradley said, kneeling in front of paintings that reimagined power and worthiness. "I love your mind, your strength, your culture, your family, your ambition. I want to build something together that's bigger than what either of us could create alone." The ring was perfect: classic elegance with a contemporary setting that honored tradition while looking toward the future. Like their relationship, Keisha thought. She said yes because she believed he meant it. Their wedding was a cultural celebration that honored both their backgrounds without tokenizing either. The ceremony took place at the San Francisco Botanical Garden, with officiation by both a Unitarian minister and Pastor Williams from Keisha's home church in Detroit. The reception featured a jazz quartet alongside a DJ who seamlessly blended everything from Motown to contemporary R&B to the kind of indie rock that Bradley's Stanford friends appreciated. But even on their wedding day, subtle tensions suggested fault lines that would later crack wide open. "She's lovely," Bradley's mother, Patricia Harrison, said to her son during the reception, watching Keisha laugh with her college friends. "Very articulate. Very polished." The word polished carried weight. As if Keisha's natural elegance was a performance rather than an authentic expression of who she'd always been. "She's brilliant, Mom," Bradley replied, not quite catching the coded language. "She's made me a better person and a better businessman." "Of course, darling. I just hope she understands the expectations that come with the Harrison name." Expectations. Another loaded word in a family where traditions carried the weight of generational wealth and social positioning. Keisha heard these conversations in fragments, whispered concerns about fitting in and maintaining standards. She processed them as the inevitable adjustment period that came with any marriage, especially one that crossed cultural lines. She was confident in her ability to navigate white social spaces, and she trusted Bradley to support her when navigation became necessary. But trust, Keisha would learn, could be a dangerous foundation when built on assumptions rather than tested commitment. Their honeymoon in Santorini was perfect. Private villa, azure waters, long conversations about building a future together. But their return to San Francisco marked the beginning of a more complex negotiation. Keisha was now Mrs. Harrison, with access to social circles and business networks that had previously been closed to her. Bradley was now married to a Black woman, which meant his friends and family were forced to confront their own comfort levels with diversity in their most intimate spaces. "We should host a dinner party," Bradley suggested one morning over coffee and the Wall Street Journal. "Something small but elegant. Introduce you properly to the core group." "The core group?" Keisha asked. "My closest friends. Business partners. The people who matter for long-term strategic relationships." Strategic relationships. Even in marriage, Keisha noticed, Bradley's world operated on calculated connections rather than authentic friendships. But she agreed to the dinner party, recognizing it as necessary political theater for her husband's career advancement. She spent days planning a menu that would showcase her sophistication without being too ethnic for their guests' comfort levels. She selected wines that would impress without intimidating. She chose an outfit that was elegant but not too bold, professional but not too corporate, beautiful but not too attention-grabbing. The performance of respectability was exhausting, but Keisha had been managing similar performances her entire professional career. The dinner party was a success by all measurable standards. 8 couples, perfectly balanced conversation, excellent food, and general approval of Bradley's choice in wives. But Keisha noticed how often she was asked to explain or defend positions that would never be questioned if expressed by a white woman. How her expertise was met with surprise rather than respect. How conversations shifted when she entered rooms, becoming more carefully polite and less authentically engaged. "That went well," Bradley said as they cleaned up afterward. "Did it?" Keisha asked. "Everyone loved you. Michael said you were the most interesting person he'd talked to in months. Because I was interesting or because I was an interesting black woman?" Bradley paused, considering her question more seriously than she'd expected. "Does it matter as long as they respect you?" It was a question that would echo through their marriage, growing louder with each subsequent social event, business dinner, and family gathering. The question of whether respect built on novelty was the same as respect built on recognition of inherent worth. Comment below if you've ever felt like you had to shrink yourself for someone else's comfort, because this marriage is about to get complicated. Meanwhile, as Keisha navigated the social complexities of her new status, she was simultaneously revolutionizing Bradley's business in ways that neither of them fully understood at the time. Harrison Tech Solutions had been profitable but unremarkable before Keisha's influence. Bradley's company specialized in enterprise software for mid-sized companies, competing in a crowded market where relationships often mattered more than innovation. But Keisha's strategic mind and cultural intelligence began opening doors that had previously been invisible. "What if we stopped thinking about market expansion as selling our existing products to new demographics?" Keisha suggested during a strategy session, "and started thinking about developing products that addressed needs we've never considered?" Her insight led to Harrison Tech's first breakthrough product, a customer relationship management system designed specifically for small businesses in urban markets. Instead of the complex, expensive platforms that dominated the enterprise space, Keisha had identified a need for intuitive, affordable solutions that could help family-owned businesses, community organizations, and local service providers manage their customer relationships more effectively. The product launched 18 months after their wedding and exceeded revenue projections by 300%. Suddenly, Harrison Tech Solutions wasn't just another enterprise software company, they were innovators who understood markets that their competitors ignored. "You've tripled our revenue in 2 years," Bradley told Keisha over dinner at their favorite restaurant. "I should be paying you a consulting fee on top of your wife's salary." It was meant as a joke, but the phrase "wife's salary" caught Keisha's attention. As if her contributions to his business success were informal rather than strategic, personal rather than professional. "Maybe you should put me on the board," Keisha replied, half joking herself. "Maybe I should," Bradley said, but his tone suggested the idea was more theoretical than practical. That conversation would prove prophetic in ways neither of them anticipated. As Harrison Tech's success grew, so did Bradley's confidence and social status. Invitations to more exclusive events. Requests for business magazine interviews. Opportunities to speak at industry conferences where he was positioned as a thought leader rather than simply another tech entrepreneur. But with success came subtle changes in how Bradley viewed their partnership. Keisha's contributions began to be framed as supportive rather than foundational. Her cultural insights became his business acumen in stories he told at industry events. Her strategic recommendations became his innovative approaches in interviews and presentations. "I loved your talk at TechCrunch," Keisha said after attending one of Bradley's keynote presentations. "Though I noticed you didn't mention that the urban market strategy came from our conversations about cultural capital and community trust building." "I can't cite every conversation we've had," Bradley replied, but his defensiveness suggested he understood her point. "People expect to hear about my vision, not a play-by-play of our dinner table discussions." It was a reasonable explanation. It was also the beginning of a pattern where Keisha's intellectual contributions were absorbed into Bradley's professional identity without explicit acknowledgement. But Keisha was building her own professional identity simultaneously. Strategic cultural solutions continued to grow, with clients seeking her expertise for increasingly complex market expansion projects. Her speaking engagements multiplied. Business publications began featuring her as an expert on diversity and market innovation rather than simply as Bradley Harrison's accomplished wife. The parallel success should have strengthened their marriage. Instead, it created new tensions around attention, credit, and whose career took priority when conflicts arose. The Goldman Sachs Diversity Summit is next Thursday, Keisha mentioned during their weekly calendar review. I'm the closing keynote speaker. Next Thursday is the venture capital networking event for our Series B funding round, Bradley replied. I was hoping you'd come with me. Having you there makes our company look more innovative and forward-thinking. The request was reasonable. The language was problematic. Keisha's presence was valuable for how it made Bradley's company appear rather than for her own professional contributions. Can't you network without me? Keisha asked. Of course I can. But having you there gives us a competitive advantage. Investors are prioritizing companies with diverse leadership teams. I'm not part of your leadership team, Keisha pointed out. I'm your wife who happens to have expertise in diversity strategy. Right, but they don't need to know the technical details. The technical details. As if her professional achievements were administrative footnotes rather than substantial credentials. Keisha attended the venture capital event, delivering impromptu insights about market opportunities that helped Bradley secure the funding round. But the Goldman Sachs keynote, her first invitation to address an audience of that caliber, was rescheduled for a smaller, less prestigious conference. It was a trade-off that made business sense. It was also a preview of how their career priorities would be negotiated throughout their marriage, with Bradley's opportunities consistently taking precedence over Keisha's professional advancement. We're a team, Bradley said when Keisha expressed frustration about missing the Goldman Sachs opportunity. Sometimes that means making sacrifices for the greater good. The greater good. Another phrase that sounded reasonable but carried weight. As if Bradley's success was inherently more valuable than Keisha's individual achievements. But Keisha was learning to navigate these negotiations with strategic patience. She was building relationships and credentials that would eventually create opportunities too significant to be rescheduled for her husband's convenience. She just didn't know how soon that day would come. Smash that subscribe button if you believe love should conquer all barriers, because this marriage is about to face its ultimate test. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala at the Ritz-Carlton was supposed to be routine. Another philanthropic event where San Francisco's elite gathered to write tax-deductible checks while networking over champagne and congratulating themselves on their social consciousness. Bradley and Keisha had attended dozens of similar events, playing their roles as the successful interracial couple who proved that love and ambition could transcend cultural boundaries. But October 15, 2022 would be the night that Bradley Harrison first laid eyes on Anastasia Volkov, and everything he thought he wanted from life would begin its inevitable transformation. Anastasia was the featured model for the evening's fashion show, a segment of the gala where local designers showcased their work while models glided down a runway constructed between dining tables. At 23, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that stopped conversations mid-sentence. Platinum blonde hair that caught light like spun silk, ice blue eyes that photographed perfectly from every angle, and the 5'10" frame that made clothing look like art. She was everything that Bradley's world had taught him to value in a woman. Young, beautiful, white, and uncomplicated by the kind of professional ambition that might compete with his own success. She's stunning, Patricia Harrison whispered to her son as Anastasia walked past their table in a flowing silver gown that seemed to defy gravity. Very Grace Kelly. Grace Kelly. The comparison wasn't accidental. Patricia Harrison's approval was rarely offered freely, especially when it came to women in her son's orbit. But Anastasia represented something safe, familiar, and socially appropriate in ways that Keisha, for all her intelligence and success, would never quite achieve in Patricia's estimation. Bradley found himself watching Anastasia's movement with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports. There was something hypnotic about her confidence on the runway, the way she made every gesture look effortless and natural. When she smiled, it was radiant but not too bright, engaging but not too familiar. Perfect. Earth to Bradley, Keisha said, her voice carrying just enough edge to suggest she'd noticed his distraction. The auction is starting. Bradley snapped back to attention, but something had shifted. For the rest of the evening he found himself stealing glances at Anastasia as she mingled with guests, signed autographs for charity supporters, and posed for photographers. She moved through the crowd with the kind of grace that came from being universally welcomed, never questioned, never required to prove her worthiness for inclusion. Did you enjoy the fashion show? Keisha asked during the drive home. It was fine, Bradley replied, but his tone suggested his thoughts were elsewhere. The models were beautiful. Very traditional. Traditional. Keisha's word choice was careful, but her meaning was clear. The fashion show had featured predominantly white models, with token diversity that felt performative rather than authentic. It was the kind of aesthetic that reinforced conventional beauty standards rather than challenging them. I guess, Bradley said. I wasn't really paying attention to the models. It was a lie and they both knew it. 3 weeks later, Bradley attended a tech industry mixer in Soma where venture capitalists and entrepreneurs gathered to discuss funding opportunities and strategic partnerships. Anastasia was there as the guest of Marcus Webb, a cryptocurrency investor whose approach to wealth was more nouveau riche than old money, expensive cars, flashy jewelry, and young models as social accessories. Bradley Harrison. Marcus called out as he spotted Bradley at the bar. Come meet the most beautiful woman in San Francisco. The introduction was crude but effective. Bradley found himself shaking hands with Anastasia Volkov, whose beauty was even more striking in person than it had been under the charity gala's dramatic lighting. Marcus tells me you're some kind of tech genius, Anastasia said, her Russian accent adding exotic appeal to standard small talk. I wouldn't say genius, Bradley replied, immediately sliding into the kind of false modesty that successful men use to seem humble while highlighting their achievements. I just built a company that helps other businesses understand their customers better. That sounds very important, Anastasia said, her blue eyes focusing on him with the kind of attention that made Bradley feel simultaneously powerful and protective. It's challenging work, Bradley continued, but rewarding when you can help someone reach markets they never knew existed. He was unconsciously echoing language he'd learned from Keisha, but applying it to impress a woman who had no context for understanding cultural market expansion or diversity strategy. To Anastasia, Bradley's success was impressive in its simplicity. He was rich, accomplished, and interested in her. The details were less important than the result. I would love to hear more about your business, Anastasia said. Perhaps over dinner sometime? The invitation was direct but not aggressive. Professional but personal. Exactly the kind of approach that allowed Bradley to convince himself that his interest was platonic even as his attraction grew more obvious with each passing minute. I'm married, Bradley said, but his tone suggested the statement was informational rather than definitional. Of course, Anastasia replied smoothly. I meant a business dinner. I'm always interested in learning about different industries. Business dinner. The phrase provided just enough plausible deniability for Bradley to agree without acknowledging what was actually happening. 2 days later, Bradley found himself at Boulevard Restaurant with Anastasia, ostensibly discussing potential modeling opportunities for Harrison Tech's marketing campaigns. The conversation was superficial but engaging, covering topics that required no intellectual heavy lifting. Fashion, travel, the challenge of building a modeling career in a competitive industry. You seem very sophisticated for someone so young, Bradley said over their shared dessert. I've had to grow up quickly, Anastasia replied. Modeling is not just about being beautiful. It's about understanding what people want to see, what makes them feel comfortable and attracted. Understanding what people want to see. It was a skill that Anastasia had mastered, and Bradley was discovering how pleasant it felt to be seen exactly as he'd always wanted to see himself, successful, powerful, and worthy of beauty that required no complicated negotiations. Tell me about your wife, Anastasia said, her directness catching Bradley off guard. Keisha? 'Tis incredible. Brilliant businesswoman. She's taught me more about strategy and market intelligence than any consultant I've ever hired. She sounds very accomplished, Anastasia said. It must be challenging being married to someone so ambitious. Challenging. The word lodged itself in Bradley's consciousness, framing Keisha's professional success as a burden rather than an asset. With Anastasia, Bradley realized he didn't have to negotiate career priorities or share credit for business insights. He could simply be successful without explanation or complexity. Sometimes, Bradley admitted, Keisha has very strong opinions about how things should be done. I imagine she does, Anastasia replied sympathetically. Successful women often do. The conversation continued for 2 more hours, touching on topics that felt wonderfully uncomplicated compared to the cultural and professional negotiations that characterized Bradley's marriage. Anastasia was interested in his success without wanting to understand its technical details. She was impressed by his wealth without questioning how it was accumulated or distributed. She was attracted to his power without challenging how it was used. When Bradley returned home that evening, Keisha was working in their home office, preparing for a presentation to a Fortune 500 client about cultural intelligence in global market expansion. How was your meeting? Keisha asked without looking up from her laptop. Productive, Bradley replied. We're exploring some marketing opportunities. With a modeling agency? With a specific model. For our upcoming product launch campaign. Keisha finally looked up, her expression suggesting she understood more than Bradley's careful language was revealing. Since when do we use model spokeswoman for enterprise software? Since we started targeting broader market demographics, Bradley replied, unconsciously using Keisha's own strategic framework to justify his growing attraction to Anastasia. Visual representation matters for brand positioning. Visual representation. It was true, but not in the way Bradley was suggesting. He wasn't interested in Anastasia's potential contribution to Harrison Tech's marketing strategy. He was interested in how she made him feel about himself. Successful enough to attract beauty without complexity, powerful enough to command attention without explanation. Over the following weeks, Bradley's business meetings with Anastasia became more frequent and less professional. Lunch meetings evolved into afternoon coffee sessions. Coffee sessions extended into early evening drinks. Drinks began including conversations that had nothing to do with marketing campaigns and everything to do with personal compatibility. I love how simple you make everything seem, Bradley told Anastasia during one of their increasingly intimate conversations. No hidden agendas, no complicated negotiations. Just easy. Life should be easy, Anastasia replied. Especially for someone who works as hard as you do. Easy. It was what Bradley hadn't realized he'd been craving until Anastasia offered it so generously. Marriage to Keisha required constant calibration, cultural sensitivity, professional respect, intellectual engagement. Dating Anastasia felt like vacation from the emotional labor that interracial relationships demanded in predominantly white social spaces. But ease, Bradley would discover, often comes at the expense of depth. I think I'm falling in love with you, Bradley said during a dinner at the French Laundry, a romantic setting that made his confession feel inevitable rather than calculated. I know, Anastasia replied, her confidence suggesting she'd been managing this outcome since their first business dinner. The question is what you're going to do about it. What he was going to do about it. Bradley had been avoiding that question for weeks, but Anastasia's directness forced him to confront the choice he'd been postponing through layers of professional justification. He could return to his marriage with Keisha, intellectually stimulating but culturally complicated, professionally rewarding but personally demanding. Or he could pursue something with Anastasia that felt like everything his upbringing had taught him to want, beautiful, uncomplicated, and socially acceptable in ways that required no explanation or defense. I want to be with you, Bradley said. But I need to handle my marriage responsibly. Responsibly. The word suggested careful planning rather than emotional impulse, strategic consideration rather than moral reckoning. I understand, Anastasia said. Take the time you need. But don't take too long. It was both permission and ultimatum, giving Bradley the space to negotiate his transition while making clear that Anastasia's patience had limits. That night, Bradley returned home to find Keisha preparing for another business trip, a conference in Atlanta where she would be speaking about cultural competency in international business development. How was dinner? Keisha asked, already knowing the answer from Bradley's guilty expression and expensive cologne that didn't match his usual brand. Fine, Bradley replied. Just networking. Networking, Keisha repeated, her tone suggesting the word had different meanings depending on who was using it. Keisha, we need to talk. No, she said quietly. We really don't. She had known this conversation was coming for weeks. The late meetings, the changed energy, the way Bradley looked at her as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a partner to be cherished. Keisha had built her career on reading cultural dynamics and understanding power structures. She could see the end of her marriage approaching with the same clarity she brought to business strategy. I don't want to hurt you, Bradley said. Then don't, Keisha replied. But if you're going to do it quickly. It was the kind of direct communication that had attracted Bradley to Keisha initially but now felt like another burden he was eager to escape. I think we want different things, Bradley said, falling back on language that made their fundamental incompatibility seem mutual rather than his personal choice. I think you've found someone who wants the same things you want, Keisha replied. And I think you've realized that what I want, partnership, respect, authentic love, is more complicated than you're prepared to handle. The accuracy of her assessment stung precisely because it was delivered without anger or accusation. Keisha understood Bradley better than he understood himself. and her clarity about his motivations made his decision feel both inevitable and shameful. "It doesn't have to be ugly," Bradley said. "No," Keisha agreed. "But it's going to be final. If you're Team Keisha and think she should have seen this coming, let me know in the comments because what happens next will change everything." The discovery came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Keisha was preparing for a conference call with a potential client in London, reviewing market analysis reports while Bradley supposedly attended an early morning board meeting. But as she reached for her phone charger behind Bradley's desk, her hand brushed against a small velvet box that had been hastily shoved between papers. "Tiffany & Company. Engagement ring. Not the kind of gift you buy for your wife of 2 years." Keisha sat down slowly, holding the box with the kind of careful attention she usually reserved for reviewing contracts. The ring was beautiful, classic solitaire setting, flawless diamond, exactly the kind of traditional engagement ring that someone like Anastasia would expect and appreciate. It was also evidence that Bradley's business meetings had evolved far beyond what he'd been admitting. She didn't open the box. She didn't need to. The receipt tucked underneath told her everything she needed to know. $47,000 purchased 3 days earlier, charged to the credit card that Bradley used for business expenses. Business expenses. Even his betrayal was tax-deductible. Keisha placed the box back where she'd found it and continued preparing for her conference call. But something fundamental had shifted. The marriage she'd been trying to save was already over. Bradley had made his choice and purchased the evidence to prove it. Now she had to decide how to respond to his decision. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Bradley, "Running late this morning. Don't wait up. We'll talk tonight. We'll talk tonight." The conversation where he would tell her about Anastasia, about his need for something different, about how their marriage had run its course. The conversation where he would try to make their divorce seem mutual and amicable instead of acknowledging that he was abandoning her for a younger, whiter, simpler option. But Keisha had never been passive in any negotiation, personal or professional. If Bradley wanted to end their marriage, she would make sure he understood exactly what he was throwing away. That evening, Bradley returned home with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd been rehearsing a speech. He found Keisha in the living room, reading a book and drinking wine, appearing completely relaxed. "We need to talk," Bradley said, sitting down across from her with the careful distance of someone who expected an emotional explosion. "About your engagement to Anastasia?" Keisha asked, not looking up from her book. Bradley's face went pale. "How did you? The ring box behind your desk. Either you're planning to propose to me again, or you've been shopping for someone else." She finally looked up, her expression calm but her eyes sharp with the kind of controlled anger that was more dangerous than screaming. "Keisha, I can explain." "No need," she said, closing her book and setting it aside. "You've fallen in love with a beautiful young white woman who makes you feel successful without challenging you to actually be better. It's the oldest story in the book." Her clinical assessment of his motivations was more devastating than accusations or tears would have been. Bradley had expected guilt, manipulation, or emotional breakdown. Instead, he was facing someone who understood his psychology better than he did. "It's not that simple," Bradley said. "Of course it is," Keisha replied. "You married me because I was impressive enough to make you look progressive and intelligent enough to make you more successful. But maintaining a relationship with a black woman in your social circles required more emotional labor than you were prepared to invest long-term. That's not fair." "Fair?" Keisha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Bradley, you spent our entire marriage using my cultural insights to build your business while introducing me to your friends as if I were a fascinating exotic acquisition. You never saw me as an equal partner. You saw me as a strategic advantage." The accuracy of her analysis was undeniable. Bradley had benefited enormously from Keisha's intelligence and cultural competency, but he had never fully acknowledged her contributions as foundational rather than supportive. "I want you to be happy," Bradley said, falling back on language that made his betrayal sound generous. "I'm sure you do," Keisha replied. "As long as my happiness doesn't interfere with your comfort." She stood up, walking to the window that overlooked their garden, the home they'd chosen together, decorated with art from both their cultures, filled with plans for a future that Bradley was now abandoning. "I'll make this easy for you," Keisha said. "I want an uncontested divorce. Equal division of assets, including business holdings that I contributed to developing. I want it done quickly and quietly." Bradley was surprised by her reasonable tone. He'd expected demands, threats, or attempts to negotiate for a larger settlement. "That sounds fair," he said. "It's not fair," Keisha replied. Fair would be acknowledging that you built your success on my insights and cultural intelligence. Fair would be recognizing that I made you a better businessman and a more interesting person. Fair would be admitting that you're not leaving me for someone better, you're leaving me for someone easier. She turned back to face him, and Bradley saw something in her expression that made him uncomfortable. Not sadness or anger but calculation. Strategic thinking. But I'm not interested in fair, Keisha continued. I'm interested in moving forward. So take your engagement ring, marry your supermodel, and enjoy your uncomplicated life. 2 weeks later, the divorce proceedings began with exactly the kind of efficiency that Keisha had promised. But what Bradley hadn't anticipated was how quickly word would spread through Silicon Valley's interconnected social and business networks. Tech industry publications picked up the story first. Harrison Tech founder divorces diversity consultant wife. The coverage was neutral but curious, focusing on the timing of the divorce during Harrison Tech's most successful period and questioning how the separation might affect the company's market positioning. But social media told a different story. Keisha's professional network, diversity consultants, Black business leaders, women in tech, began sharing their own experiences with white men who had used their expertise for professional advancement before discarding them for more conventional partners. Another white tech bro who married a brilliant black woman for her insights, then left her for a model when he felt successful enough to upgrade, wrote Dr. Cheryl Williams, a prominent business strategy consultant, in a LinkedIn post that was shared over 10,000 times. The pattern is so predictable it should have its own business case study, added Maria Santos, a venture capitalist who had worked with both Bradley and Keisha professionally. Use diverse talent to build success, then revert to type when you feel secure enough to prioritize comfort over growth. Bradley watched his social media mentions multiply, shifting from congratulations on his business success to criticism of his personal choices. The narrative was crystallizing into something that made him look opportunistic rather than simply unlucky in love. It's not about race, Bradley told his business partner during an emergency strategy meeting. It's about compatibility. Keisha and I wanted different things. The internet doesn't seem to agree, Michael replied, scrolling through Twitter threads that were dissecting Bradley's marriage and divorce with the kind of detailed analysis usually reserved for corporate mergers. This is becoming a problem for our brand positioning. Brand positioning. Even Bradley's personal life was being evaluated through business metrics. The situation deteriorated further when Anastasia made her first public appearance as Bradley's girlfriend at a tech industry gala in Palo Alto. Photographers captured them together. Bradley in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, Anastasia in a stunning white gown that made her look like exactly what she was. A young, beautiful, socially acceptable replacement for his more complicated previous wife. But the photos that went viral weren't the romantic couple's shots. They were the images of Bradley and Anastasia looking lost and out of place in conversations with tech industry leaders who had previously sought Keisha's insights on market strategy and cultural intelligence. Where's the brilliant wife who actually built your business? Venture capitalist Jennifer Kim asked Bradley directly during the cocktail reception, her question loud enough to be overheard by several other attendees. Keisha and I are divorced, Bradley replied, his discomfort obvious. I know, Jennifer said. I'm just wondering how you plan to maintain the competitive advantages she provided now that you've moved on. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Bradley realized that his divorce hadn't just ended his marriage. It had also dissolved a business partnership that he'd never formally acknowledged but had been essential to his company's success. Harrison Tech's strategy isn't dependent on any one person, Bradley said, but his defensive tone undermined his confidence. Of course not, Jennifer replied. I'm sure your new girlfriend has equally impressive insights about diverse market expansion and cultural intelligence. Anastasia smiled uncomfortably, recognizing that she was being discussed but not understanding the professional context that made her presence feel like a step backward rather than an upgrade. Over the following months, Bradley began to understand the full cost of his personal decision. Harrison Tech's growth slowed as the company struggled to maintain relationships with diverse market segments that Keisha had cultivated. Business conferences that had previously invited Bradley as a thought leader on inclusive market strategies stopped calling. Potential clients who had been impressed by his company's cultural competency began questioning whether that competency had been authentic or performed. We need to hire a diversity consultant, Michael suggested during a quarterly review where their revenue projections had been revised downward for the third consecutive month. We can't, Bradley replied. It would look like we're trying to replace Keisha. Aren't we? The question was fair but painful. Bradley was discovering that his business success had been more intertwined with his marriage than he'd been willing to acknowledge. Keisha's insights, cultural intelligence, and strategic thinking had been foundational to Harrison Tech's competitive advantages. Without her informal consultation, the company was reverting to its previous status as just another enterprise software provider in a crowded market. Meanwhile, Anastasia was struggling with her own set of challenges. Dating a recently divorced businessman came with scrutiny she hadn't anticipated. Fashion photographers who had previously been eager to work with her began questioning her judgment and professional focus. Modeling agencies suggested that her association with a controversial tech executive might limit her commercial appeal. "I thought you were more successful," Anastasia said during a dinner where Bradley had been noticeably distracted by work stress and negative media coverage. "I am successful," Bradley replied, but his tone lacked the confidence that had attracted Anastasia initially. "Then why does everyone keep asking me about your ex-wife?" Was a fair question. Bradley had assumed that divorcing Keisha would simplify his life and improve his social positioning. Instead, it had created new complications and highlighted dependencies he'd been unwilling to acknowledge. "People will forget about Keisha once we establish our own dynamic," Bradley said. "When will that be?" Anastasia asked. Bradley didn't have an answer. But Keisha, meanwhile, was discovering that freedom from Bradley's limiting expectations was more liberating than she'd anticipated. Strategic Cultural Solutions was experiencing unprecedented growth as former clients sought her expertise directly rather than through Harrison Tech's partnership. Speaking engagements multiplied. Business publications wanted interviews about her insights on market intelligence and cultural competency. "It's interesting," Keisha told her business partner during a strategy session 6 months after the divorce. "Being divorced from Bradley has actually enhanced my professional credibility. People are finally seeing my work as independent rather than derivative. Maybe they're also seeing how much his success depended on your contributions," her partner replied. "Maybe," Keisha agreed. "But that's his problem now." She was right. It was Bradley's problem. And it was about to become much bigger than a few negative social media posts or declining business metrics. Because while Bradley was struggling to maintain his previous success, Keisha was building something entirely new. Something that would soon make their previous power dynamic look quaint by comparison. Smash that subscribe button if you believe the best revenge is massive success, because Keisha's transformation is just getting started. 18 months after their divorce was finalized, Bradley Harrison and Keisha Williams were living in parallel universes that occasionally intersected through business publications and social media, creating a constant reminder of choices made and opportunities lost. Bradley's universe was shrinking. What had initially felt like liberation, freedom from cultural negotiations, professional complexity, and the emotional labor of an interracial marriage, had gradually revealed itself as isolation. His relationship with Anastasia, while visually appealing and socially uncomplicated, lacked the intellectual stimulation and strategic partnership that had characterized his marriage to Keisha. "I'm thinking about expanding into fashion marketing," Anastasia announced over breakfast at their Pacific Heights penthouse, scrolling through Instagram while consuming her daily meal of Greek yogurt and berries. "Fashion marketing?" Bradley asked, looking up from the Wall Street Journal and quarterly reports that had replaced morning conversations about business strategy and cultural insights. "Yes, like consulting for brands about how to reach younger demographics. I understand what millennials and Gen Z want to see." It was a reasonable idea, but Bradley found himself missing the depth of analysis that Keisha would have brought to market expansion discussions. Where Keisha understood cultural nuance, demographic complexity, and long-term strategic implications, Anastasia saw opportunities through the lens of aesthetic appeal and social media engagement. "That sounds interesting," Bradley said, but his tone lacked enthusiasm. "You don't think I'm smart enough for business?" Anastasia replied, her defensiveness suggesting this wasn't their first conversation about intellectual compatibility. "That's not what I said. You don't have to say it. I can see how you look at me when I talk about my ideas." She was right. Bradley had been unconsciously comparing Anastasia's business instincts to Keisha's strategic brilliance, and the comparison was unfavorable in ways that made him feel guilty about his own superficiality. "I think you're very intelligent," Bradley said. "Just differently intelligent than I'm used to." Differently intelligent. It was coded language that meant Anastasia was beautiful and socially competent but lacked the analytical depth that Bradley had come to expect from intimate partnerships. The conversation ended with Anastasia retreating to her phone and Bradley returning to his newspaper, both recognizing that their relationship worked better when they avoided topics that highlighted their intellectual incompatibility. Harrison Tech Solutions was facing similar challenges with substance versus surface appeal. Without Keisha's cultural intelligence guiding their market strategy, the company had struggled to maintain relationships with diverse client bases that had been essential to their growth trajectory. Our retention rate in urban markets is down 37%, Michael reported during their monthly business review. And we're losing ground to competitors who seem to understand these communities better than we do. What do you think the problem is? Bradley asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Honestly, I think we lost our cultural competency when Keisha left. She was the one who understood how to build authentic relationships with diverse market segments. It was an admission that Bradley had been avoiding for months. Harrison Tech's success hadn't been solely due to his technical innovation or business acumen. Keisha's insights about cultural dynamics, community trust building, and authentic market engagement had been foundational to their competitive advantages. We should hire a diversity consultant, Bradley said, repeating a suggestion he'd been resisting since the divorce. We tried that, Michael replied. Remember? 3 different consulting firms. None of them could replicate what Keisha brought to our strategy sessions. What Keisha brought. It wasn't just professional expertise, it was personal investment in the company's success, intimate knowledge of Bradley's business philosophy, and cultural intelligence that came from lived experience rather than academic study. Maybe we need to pivot our market focus, Bradley suggested. Concentrate on enterprise clients where cultural complexity is less of a factor. You mean retreat to predominantly white corporate markets? Bradley nodded, recognizing the irony. After building his reputation on inclusive market expansion, he was now considering abandoning diversity strategy because it required expertise he no longer had access to. It might be more sustainable long-term, Bradley said. It's definitely less profitable, Michael replied. Those diverse market segments were our highest growth revenue streams. The business implications of Bradley's personal decisions were becoming impossible to ignore. His divorce hadn't just ended his marriage, it had also dissolved an informal business partnership that had been essential to Harrison Tech's competitive positioning. Meanwhile, 40 miles south in San Jose, Keisha was building something that would soon make Harrison Tech's market retreat look short-sighted by comparison. Strategic cultural solutions had evolved far beyond traditional diversity consulting. Keisha's client base now included Fortune 500 companies seeking cultural intelligence for international expansion, tech startups wanting authentic community engagement strategies, and investment firms looking to understand emerging market opportunities in diverse global demographics. We need to scale, Keisha told her business partner, Aisha Patel, during a strategy session in their new office space. The demand for our services is growing faster than we can handle with our current capacity. Scale how? Aisha asked. Acquisition. There are smaller consulting firms in Atlanta, Chicago, and Los Angeles that specialize in cultural market analysis. If we acquire them and integrate their expertise with our strategic framework, we could offer comprehensive cultural intelligence services nationwide. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had made Keisha invaluable to Bradley's business. But now she was applying it to building her own empire rather than supporting someone else's success. That's going to require significant capital, Aisha pointed out. I know, Keisha replied. I've been talking to some venture capital firms about series of funding. Venture capital funding. For a diversity consulting firm. It was an unusual approach that suggested Keisha was thinking about cultural intelligence as a scalable business model rather than a specialized service offering. How much are you thinking? Aisha asked. $15 million for 30% equity. The numbers represented a valuation that would make strategic cultural solutions worth more than many established tech companies. It was also a valuation that would make Keisha personally wealthy in ways that transcended her divorce settlement from Bradley. You think investors will see that kind of value in cultural consulting? Aisha asked. I think smart investors are starting to realize that cultural intelligence is the next competitive frontier, Keisha replied. Companies that understand how to authentically engage diverse global markets will dominate the next decade of business growth. She was right. The business landscape was shifting toward cultural competency as a strategic advantage rather than a moral obligation. Companies that had historically treated diversity as a compliance requirement were beginning to recognize it as a revenue opportunity. But Keisha's vision extended beyond traditional business consulting. She was developing a comprehensive platform that would combine cultural intelligence with data analytics, market research, and strategic planning to help companies build authentic relationships with diverse global demographics. Think of it like McKinsey for cultural strategy, Keisha explained to potential investors. But instead of general business consulting, we specialize in helping companies understand and engage markets they've never been able to reach effectively. The investor meetings were going better than Keisha had anticipated. Venture capital firms that had historically overlooked diversity-focused businesses were now actively seeking opportunities in the cultural intelligence space. Market expansion into diverse demographics represents a trillion-dollar opportunity, Keisha told a room full of Silicon Valley investors. But most companies approach it with the same strategies that work for their existing customer base. That's like trying to speak French by talking louder in English. Her presentations combined business strategy with cultural education, helping investors understand that diversity wasn't just about representation. It was about fundamentally different approaches to decision-making, community building, and brand loyalty. We've seen companies increase revenue by 300 to 500% in underserved markets within 18 months of implementing our cultural intelligence strategies, Keisha continued. The return on investment isn't just measurable, it's transformational. By month 6 of her fundraising efforts, Keisha had received term sheets from 3 different venture capital firms. But the most interesting offer came from Blackstone Strategic Partners, a firm that specialized in scaling consulting companies into global enterprises. "We don't just want to fund your business," managing partner David Chin told Keisha during their final negotiation meeting. "We want to help you build the definitive platform for cultural intelligence. Think Goldman Sachs for diversity strategy." Goldman Sachs for diversity strategy. It was exactly the kind of ambitious vision that Keisha had been developing since her divorce from Bradley. "What kind of timeline are you thinking?" Keisha asked. 18 months to establish operations in 6 major markets. 3 years to international expansion. 5 years to IPO. Initial public offering. The conversation had moved from consulting business to potential public company in ways that would make strategic cultural solutions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "We're also interested in your personal story," David continued. "The narrative of a black woman building a successful business after divorce from a white tech executive who undervalued her contributions. That's compelling for our marketing strategy." Personal story. Even Keisha's divorce was becoming a business asset rather than simply personal trauma. "I'm interested," Keisha said. "But I want to maintain majority control and final decision-making authority." "Of course," David replied. "This is your vision. We're just providing the capital and infrastructure to scale it." 1 week later, Keisha signed term sheets that would make her one of the wealthiest black women in Silicon Valley and position Strategic Cultural Solutions as the dominant player in cultural intelligence consulting. The announcement made business headlines. Former diversity consultant raises $47 million to build cultural intelligence empire. The timing was notable, exactly 2 years after her divorce from Bradley Harrison. Bradley read the news while reviewing Harrison Tech's disappointing quarterly reports. His ex-wife had just raised nearly as much money as his entire company was worth. The woman he'd left for someone simpler was now building something more complex and valuable than anything he'd ever accomplished. "Did you see the announcement about Keisha's funding round?" Michael asked during their next business meeting. "I saw it," Bradley replied, his tone suggesting the topic was unwelcome. $47 million. For a consulting firm. "It's not just consulting," Bradley said, recognizing strategic implications that he'd taught Keisha to identify during their marriage. "She's building a platform. Cultural intelligence as a service. Should we reach out? See if there are partnership opportunities?" Bradley considered the suggestion. Working with Keisha's new company could potentially solve Harrison Tech's cultural competency challenges. But it would also mean acknowledging that his ex-wife had become more successful than he was, using insights and strategies they developed together during their marriage. "No," Bradley said finally. "We'll figure out our own approach." It was pride masquerading as business strategy. Bradley wasn't ready to admit that the woman he'd replaced with a supermodel had become more powerful than he could have imagined. But power, as Bradley was about to discover, had ways of making itself impossible to ignore. Comment if you think Bradley's starting to realize what he lost, because this story is about to reach its dramatic climax in Monaco. 2 years after Keisha's record-breaking funding round, Strategic Cultural Solutions had become exactly what she'd envisioned, the Goldman Sachs of diversity strategy. Offices in 12 major cities, partnerships with Fortune 100 companies, and a client roster that read like a who's who of global business leaders seeking authentic cultural intelligence. But Keisha's personal transformation had been even more dramatic than her professional success. The woman who had once carefully modulated her presence to make white corporate spaces comfortable had evolved into someone who commanded attention without apology, who expected respect without negotiation, and who moved through elite circles with the confidence of someone who belonged there by right rather than invitation. Which is how she came to receive a hand-delivered invitation to the Monaco Billionaires Gala. Not as someone's +1 or diversity appointment, but as one of the most influential business leaders in cultural strategy, personally requested by the event's organizing committee. The Monaco Gala, Keisha's assistant, Rebecca, announced as she placed the heavy paper invitation on Keisha's desk. Apparently you're being honored as one of this year's global innovation leaders. Keisha examined the invitation with the careful attention she brought to all strategic opportunities. The Monaco Billionaires Gala was legendary, an annual gathering of the world's most powerful people, where billion-dollar deals were negotiated over champagne and geopolitical alliances were formed during dancing. Invitation was by committee approval only, and the guest list never exceeded 300 people. Who else is being honored? Keisha asked. Tech innovators, pharmaceutical executives, sustainable energy pioneers, and one cultural intelligence strategist who's been transforming how global companies understand diverse markets. The recognition felt surreal. 3 years earlier, Keisha had been Bradley's wife, supporting his career advancement and managing the cultural complications of their interracial marriage. Now she was being celebrated alongside the most influential business leaders on the planet. Accept the invitation, Keisha said, and book the presidential suite at the Hotel Hermitage. The presidential suite? If I'm going to be honored as a global innovation leader, I should stay somewhere that reflects my status. It was a small but significant decision. The old Keisha would have chosen understated accommodations to avoid appearing presumptuous. The new Keisha understood that in elite circles, how you presented yourself determined how you were treated. But Keisha's invitation to Monaco wasn't the only Harrison family correspondence being delivered that week. 1,500 miles north in San Francisco, Bradley was opening his own invitation to the Monaco Gala. Not for any business achievements, but as the +1 of Anastasia Volkov, whose modeling career had achieved sufficient international recognition to warrant inclusion in the event's fashion and entertainment programming. Monaco! Anastasia exclaimed, bouncing on their bedroom's California king bed like a teenager who'd just been invited to prom. This is huge, Bradley. The Monaco Gala is where all the real celebrities and billionaires go. It's a business networking event, Bradley replied, but he was impressed despite himself. Harrison Tech's revenue had stabilized but never returned to its growth trajectory from the Keisha years, and Bradley's personal influence in Silicon Valley had plateaued accordingly. The Monaco invitation represented access to power networks that had previously been beyond his reach. What should I wear? Anastasia continued. This needs to be perfect. Everyone will be photographed. Everything for Anastasia came back to appearance and photo opportunities. After 3 years together, Bradley had stopped expecting deeper analysis or strategic thinking from their conversations. Anastasia was beautiful, socially competent, and refreshingly uncomplicated. She was also intellectually limited in ways that were becoming more problematic as Bradley's business challenges required increasingly sophisticated solutions. Wear whatever makes you feel confident, Bradley said, returning to his laptop where Harrison Tech's quarterly projections painted a picture of modest success rather than breakthrough achievement. You're not excited about this, Anastasia observed. I'm excited, Bradley replied. I'm just thinking about it differently than you are. How are you thinking about it? Bradley paused, considering how to explain strategic networking to someone whose understanding of professional advancement focused primarily on visual impact and social positioning. Events like this are opportunities to build relationships that can transform business trajectories, Bradley said. The conversations you have, the connections you make, the partnerships you develop, that's what matters. So it's like networking but with really rich people? Exactly like that. Anastasia nodded as if she understood, but Bradley could see that her excitement remained focused on the glamour rather than the strategic potential of Monaco's gathering. Meanwhile, Keisha was preparing for Monaco with the methodical attention she brought to all high-stakes business opportunities. This wasn't just a social event, it was a platform for establishing her position among global power brokers and building relationships that could scale strategic cultural solutions into international markets. I want to understand exactly who's going to be there, Keisha told her chief strategy officer during a pre-event planning session. Who are the key decision makers I should prioritize? What partnerships could accelerate our European expansion? Which investors might be interested in our Series B funding round? Her approach to Monaco was comprehensive. Research binders on key attendees, strategic talking points for different conversation scenarios, and clear objectives for relationship building that could benefit Strategic Cultural Solutions' long-term growth trajectory. But Keisha's preparation extended beyond business strategy. She was also making a statement about how successful Black women could command space in environments historically reserved for white male power brokers. Her Monaco wardrobe was curated by celebrity stylist Marcus Washington, who specialized in helping high-achieving women of color navigate elite social spaces where every detail of their presentation would be scrutinized and interpreted. "We're not trying to blend in," Marcus explained as they reviewed options for the gala's main event. "We're trying to demonstrate that you belong in this space as yourself, not as someone else's idea of what you should be." The dress they selected was stunning, midnight blue silk that complemented Keisha's skin tone, custom designed with architectural lines that suggested both sophistication and strength. The jewelry was equally strategic. Statement pieces that commanded attention without appearing ostentatious, platinum and diamonds that reflected light like confidence made tangible. "Remember," Marcus said as they finalized the styling choices, "you're not attending this event. You're commanding it." 1 week before Monaco, Keisha received a call that would add unexpected emotional complexity to her strategic business trip. "I need to give you a heads up," said Jennifer Kim, the venture capitalist who had become a close friend and business advisor. "Bradley Harrison is going to be in Monaco." "Bradley?" Keisha asked, surprised. "For what?" "His girlfriend Anastasia is modeling for the fashion segment. He's her plus one." Plus one. The words carried weight. Bradley would be attending Monaco as someone's accessory rather than as a recognized business leader in his own right. The role reversal was almost poetic. "Does he know I'll be there?" Keisha asked. "I doubt it. The honoree list isn't public, and your invitation came through the Business Leadership Committee, not the entertainment programming." Keisha considered the implications. Seeing Bradley in Monaco would be inevitable given the event's limited scope and extensive networking requirements. But it would also be the first time they'd encountered each other since the divorce in a context where their relative success and social positioning would be immediately obvious to everyone present. "How do you feel about that?" Jennifer asked. "I feel like the universe has a sense of humor," Keisha replied. But privately, Keisha was calculating the strategic implications of encountering Bradley in Monaco. She would be there as an honored guest, commanding respect and attention from global business leaders. He would be there as a model's boyfriend, seeking access to networks and opportunities that might help revive his stagnating career. The power dynamic would be unmistakable. And after 3 years of building something extraordinary from the ruins of their marriage, Keisha was ready for Bradley to see exactly what he'd thrown away. 3 days before departure, Bradley's assistant delivered his Monaco itinerary and event credentials. As he reviewed the schedule, fashion shows, cocktail receptions, networking dinners, one detail caught his attention. "VIP section access," he read aloud. "What's the VIP section?" "It's an exclusive area within the main gala," his assistant explained. "Only available to the most distinguished guests, heads of state, billionaire executives, major philanthropists." "Do I have access?" "No, sir. Your credentials are for general admission. The VIP section requires separate invitation and security clearance." General admission. Bradley had attended enough elite events to understand the hierarchical implications. He would be in the same venue as the world's most powerful people, but separated from them by velvet ropes and social stratification that money alone couldn't cross. "Can we request VIP access?" Bradley asked. "I can try," his assistant replied, "but it's typically reserved for people with significant global influence or business leadership recognition." Global influence. Business leadership recognition. The phrases stung because Bradley understood that Harrison Tech's modest success didn't qualify him for either category. He was successful enough to attend elite events, but not influential enough to command elite treatment. Still, Bradley assumed that Monaco would be an opportunity to network his way into more exclusive circles, using Anastasia's beauty and his own business credentials to gain access to conversations and connections that could transform Harrison Tech's growth trajectory. He had no way of knowing that his ex-wife would be waiting in exactly the kind of VIP section he couldn't access, surrounded by exactly the kind of global power brokers he hoped to impress, commanding exactly the kind of respect he'd never been able to achieve. The universe was preparing to deliver a masterclass in power dynamics, and Bradley Harrison was about to become its most reluctant student. Are you ready for the moment we've all been waiting for? Because this confrontation in Monaco is going to change everything. October 15, 2024. Monaco harbor sparkled under Mediterranean twilight as 300 of the world's most powerful people gathered for the annual Billionaires Gala aboard the custom-built floating venue Serenity. The 400-foot superyacht had been converted into a multi-level entertainment complex specifically for events where discretion, exclusivity, and security were paramount. Bradley Harrison adjusted his Tom Ford tuxedo as he and Anastasia stepped from their water taxi onto the yacht's main deck. Around them, global power brokers moved through reception areas with the casual confidence of people accustomed to being the most important individuals in any room. "This is incredible," Anastasia whispered, her excitement obvious as she took in the scene. Champagne service by white-gloved staff, entertainment provided by Grammy-winning musicians, and guest conversations that casually referenced billion-dollar acquisitions and geopolitical negotiations. Bradley nodded, but his attention was focused on mapping the yacht's social geography. He could see distinct levels of access and exclusion operating throughout the venue, certain areas marked with security personnel, conversations that shifted when newcomers approached, and subtle but unmistakable hierarchies that determined who commanded attention and who sought it. "Let's get drinks and start networking," Bradley suggested, guiding Anastasia toward the main bar where clusters of guests were engaging in the kind of preliminary social positioning that preceded serious business discussions. For the first hour, Bradley's networking strategy proceeded according to plan. Anastasia's beauty opened conversational doors with venture capitalists and tech executives who might otherwise have ignored Harrison Tech's founder. Bradley leveraged their initial interest into discussions about market expansion, cultural intelligence, and strategic partnerships. "Harrison Tech Solutions," repeated David Wright, managing director of a London-based investment fund. "I've heard that name before. Didn't you used to work with some kind of diversity consultant?" "Brilliant woman, if I recall correctly." "My ex-wife," Bradley replied carefully. "We divorced several years ago." "Ah yes. And she went on to build that cultural intelligence empire, didn't she? Strategic Cultural Solutions? Remarkable success story." Even at the Monaco Gala, Keisha's professional achievements were being discussed more frequently than Bradley's business credentials. The reminder was uncomfortable but not entirely surprising. Strategic Cultural Solutions had become a globally recognized brand in cultural strategy consulting. "Harrison Tech has continued to grow and evolve," Bradley said, steering the conversation toward his own accomplishments. "I'm sure," David replied, but his attention was already shifting toward other guests. "Please excuse me, I see someone I need to speak with." The conversation ended abruptly, leaving Bradley with the unsettling realization that his networking approach was generating polite interest rather than genuine enthusiasm. Harrison Tech's moderate success was respectable but unremarkable among guests whose businesses operated at scales that made Bradley's achievements look provincial by comparison. "How's it going?" Anastasia asked as she rejoined him after posing for photographs with other models and entertainment industry guests. "Fine," Bradley replied. "Just building relationships." "Have you seen the VIP section yet?" Anastasia asked. "Some of the other models were talking about it. Apparently it's on the upper deck, but you need special credentials to get in." VIP section. Bradley had noticed the restricted area during his initial survey of the yacht's layout. A glass-enclosed upper deck accessible only through security checkpoints where guest credentials were being verified by personnel with earpieces and tablet computers. "I'm sure we can get access," Bradley said with more confidence than he felt. They approached the VIP section's entrance together, where a security coordinator was checking invitations against a digital guest list. "Good evening," the coordinator said politely. "May I see your VIP credentials?" "We don't have specific VIP credentials," Bradley replied. "But I'm Bradley Harrison, founder of Harrison Tech Solutions. I assume there's been some administrative oversight." The coordinator consulted his tablet with professional courtesy. "I show general admission credentials for both of you," he said. "The VIP section is restricted to honored guests and their personally approved companions." Honored guest. The phrase suggested a level of recognition that Bradley hadn't achieved despite his business success and social connections. "Is there someone I can speak with about upgrading our access?" Bradley asked. "I'm afraid VIP status isn't available for purchase or upgrade," the coordinator replied. "It's reserved for individuals who've been specifically selected by the organizing committee." Specifically selected. By committee. For achievements and influence that Bradley apparently didn't possess despite years of building his business and social network. "That's fine," Bradley said, maintaining his composure while processing the rejection. "We're enjoying the main reception." But as they walked away from the VIP entrance, Bradley found himself studying the exclusive section with growing fascination and frustration. Through the glass walls, he could see approximately 50 guests engaged in conversations that appeared more substantive and strategic than the networking discussions happening on the main deck. "Don't worry about it," Anastasia said, trying to comfort him. "The main party is more fun anyway." More fun perhaps. But Bradley understood that the real business opportunities were happening in spaces where he wasn't welcome. The recognition stung because it highlighted limitations in his professional influence that he'd been reluctant to acknowledge. For the next 30 minutes, Bradley continued networking on the main deck while periodically glancing toward the VIP section, trying to identify the guests who commanded that level of exclusive access. Tech billionaires, pharmaceutical innovators, sustainable energy pioneers, and international business leaders whose names appeared regularly in global financial publications. And then he saw her. Keisha Williams moved through the VIP section with a kind of natural command that made everyone else appear to be seeking her attention rather than competing for it. She was wearing a midnight blue gown that caught light like liquid silk, platinum jewelry that complemented her skin tone perfectly, and the confident expression of someone who expected to be the most interesting person in any conversation. But it wasn't just her appearance that stopped Bradley's breath. It was her context. Keisha was clearly one of the VIP section's honored guests, engaged in animated discussion with a group that included individuals Bradley recognized from Forbes covers and TED Talk stages. She was commanding attention from global power brokers as an equal rather than seeking access as a supplicant. "Bradley?" Anastasia asked, noticing his distraction. "What are you looking at?" "My ex-wife," Bradley replied quietly. "Where?" Bradley nodded toward the VIP section, where Keisha was laughing at something being said by a man who Bradley vaguely recognized as a European tech billionaire. "She's in the VIP section," Anastasia observed. "Yes." "How did she get VIP access?" It was a reasonable question that Bradley couldn't answer without acknowledging truths he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Keisha had VIP access because she'd built something significant enough to warrant global recognition. She was being honored alongside the world's most influential business leaders because her work had achieved international impact and strategic importance. She belonged in that exclusive space in ways that Bradley, despite his wealth and business success, did not. "She must be there as someone's guest," Bradley said, but his tone suggested he knew the explanation was inadequate. "She doesn't look like anyone's guest," Anastasia replied with the sharp social intelligence that came from years of navigating environments where power dynamics were constantly shifting. "She looks like she's running the room." Running the room. It was an accurate assessment that made Bradley's exclusion from that same room feel more significant than simple social disappointment. As they continued watching, Keisha moved gracefully between conversations, introducing guests to each other, facilitating discussions that appeared to be generating genuine business excitement. She wasn't simply attending the VIP reception, she was orchestrating it. "I'm going to try to get closer," Bradley said impulsively. "Closer how?" "We can't get into the VIP section. The upper deck has an outdoor terrace that connects to the main deck. Maybe I can approach from there." It was a plan born of desperation rather than strategy, but Bradley needed to understand how Keisha had achieved the kind of global recognition that had eluded him despite years of business development and social networking. "Why does it matter?" Anastasia asked. "It doesn't," Bradley lied. "I'm just curious." Curious. And humiliated. And forced to confront the possibility that the woman he'd dismissed as culturally complicated had become more powerful than he'd ever imagined possible. Bradley made his way through the yacht's layout until he found stairs leading to the upper deck's outdoor terrace. The space was technically accessible to all guests, but it offered views into the VIP section's interior where Keisha was holding court with increasing confidence and obvious enjoyment. From his new vantage point, Bradley could see details that made Keisha's transformation even more striking. She wasn't just attending conversations, she was leading them. Her body language suggested someone accustomed to being listened to, respected, and sought after for her insights and strategic thinking. The man standing beside her was clearly wealthy and influential, but he was positioned as her companion rather than her patron. Their dynamic suggested partnership rather than dependence, mutual respect rather than financial arrangement. Bradley watched as Keisha noticed him through the glass walls. Their eyes met for the first time in 3 years, across a space that represented everything their marriage had failed to achieve and everything their divorce had enabled her to build. Keisha's expression was unreadable but unmistakably confident. She nodded slightly, acknowledgement without surprise, recognition without invitation. Then she turned back to her conversation, dismissing Bradley's presence as politely but definitively as the security coordinator had dismissed his request for VIP access. The message was clear. Keisha had moved beyond the space where Bradley's attention mattered. She was operating in environments where his approval was irrelevant and his recognition was unnecessary. Standing on the terrace, excluded from the conversations that mattered most, Bradley Harrison finally understood the full cost of every choice he'd made since deciding that Anastasia's simplicity was preferable to Keisha's complexity. He had traded a brilliant partner for a beautiful accessory. He had exchanged authentic cultural intelligence for comfortable social positioning. He had chosen ease over growth, familiarity over challenge, appearance over substance. And the woman he'd left behind had used his rejection as fuel to build something he could never access, achieve, or truly understand. Let me know in the comments, is this the perfect revenge or did Keisha go too far? Because the reckoning isn't over yet. The 48 hours following the Monaco Gala would be remembered by Bradley Harrison as the period when his comfortable assumptions about success, power and personal worth were systematically demolished by reality. The first blow came while Bradley and Anastasia were still in their hotel suite the morning after the event, attempting to process what they'd witnessed the night before. "Your ex-wife is trending on LinkedIn," Anastasia announced, scrolling through her phone while room service breakfast grew cold on their table. "Trending how?" Bradley asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Something about a partnership announcement. Strategic Cultural Solutions is expanding into European markets with backing from the same investment group that was at last night's VIP section." Bradley opened his own LinkedIn app to find his professional feed dominated by posts about Keisha's business development success. The partnership announcement read like a press release designed to announce global market domination. Strategic Cultural Solutions had secured $125 million in Series B funding to establish operations in London, Berlin, Paris, and Amsterdam, with plans for additional expansion into Asian markets within 18 months. But the funding details weren't the most devastating part of the announcement. The real blow came from the investor group's public statement about why they'd chosen to back Keisha's expansion. Keisha Williams represents the future of global business intelligence. Her ability to understand and navigate cultural complexity has proven essential for companies seeking authentic growth in diverse international markets. Strategic Cultural Solutions isn't just consulting, it's cultural fluency as a competitive advantage. Cultural fluency as a competitive advantage. It was exactly the kind of strategic positioning that Bradley had never achieved with Harrison Tech, despite years of effort and Keisha's informal guidance during their marriage. "How much money is that?" Anastasia asked, her tone suggesting she was beginning to understand financial implications that extended beyond modeling fees and luxury shopping budgets. "More than my company is worth," Bradley replied quietly. "Your whole company?" "My whole company." The conversation died as both of them processed what that meant for their relationship dynamic, social positioning, and future prospects. Anastasia had chosen Bradley because he represented financial security and social status. If Keisha had achieved greater wealth and influence, then Anastasia's partner selection strategy was fundamentally flawed. "Maybe we should go home," Anastasia suggested, her enthusiasm for Monaco's glamour significantly diminished. "Good idea," Bradley agreed. But returning to San Francisco only intensified Bradley's recognition of how dramatically his life trajectory had diverged from his ex-wife's success story. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications about Keisha's business coverage in tech publications, diversity and inclusion magazines, and international business journals. The most painful article appeared in Forbes 3 days after Monaco, with a headline that felt like a personal attack. "From Divorce to Dominance: How Keisha Williams Built a Global Empire from Cultural Intelligence." The piece detailed Keisha's transformation from diversity consultant supporting her tech executive husband to founder of the world's leading cultural strategy platform. But the article's most devastating section focused on the strategic partnership announcements that had emerged from her Monaco networking. Williams' expansion into European markets comes with partnership agreements from 3 Fortune 100 companies seeking cultural intelligence for international operations. Sources suggest that her client roster now includes multinational corporations willing to pay premium rates for authentic cultural competency rather than superficial diversity initiatives. Premium rates for authentic cultural competency. It was language that highlighted everything Bradley had failed to understand about Keisha's expertise during their marriage and everything he'd lost access to after their divorce. But the business coverage was only the beginning of Bradley's post-Monaco reckoning. "We need to talk," Michael said during their first business meeting after returning from Europe. The board has questions about our strategic direction. What kind of questions? Bradley asked, though recent events had prepared him for difficult conversations about Harrison Tech's competitive positioning. Questions about why our former diversity consultant is now worth more than our entire company, while we've struggled to maintain market share in the diverse demographics she used to help us understand. The board's questions were reasonable but painful. Harrison Tech had been profitable but unremarkable since Keisha's departure, while Strategic Cultural Solutions had become a globally recognized brand in cultural strategy consulting. Some board members are suggesting we should explore acquisition opportunities, Michael continued. Acquisition of what? Strategic Cultural Solutions. The suggestion was absurd and humiliating in equal measure. Bradley's company acquiring his ex-wife's business would require acknowledging that she'd built something more valuable than anything he'd achieved independently. That's not happening, Bradley said firmly. Why not? It would solve our cultural competency challenges and position us as leaders in diversity strategy. Because she'd never agree to it. How do you know? Bradley considered the question seriously. How did he know? Because he understood Keisha well enough to recognize that selling to Harrison Tech would represent a step backward rather than strategic advancement. She was building something global and transformational. Harrison Tech was a regional player seeking relevance in markets where Keisha had become the dominant expert. Because she's too smart to settle for what we could offer, Bradley admitted. The admission carried weight beyond business strategy. Bradley was acknowledging that his ex-wife had achieved something he couldn't compete with, understand, or acquire. Over the following weeks, Bradley's social media feeds became a constant reminder of choices made and opportunities lost. Keisha's business achievements were generating coverage that positioned her as a thought leader on global business strategy, cultural intelligence, and international market development. Her TED Talk on cultural competency as competitive advantage had been viewed over 2 million times. Business schools were developing case studies about strategic cultural solutions expansion model. International conferences were seeking her as a keynote speaker on topics that extended far beyond traditional diversity consulting. But the most painful reminder of Keisha's success came through an unexpected source: Anastasia's growing dissatisfaction with their relationship's trajectory. I've been thinking about my career, Anastasia announced during dinner at Gary Danko, the same restaurant where Bradley had once impressed Keisha with his cultural curiosity and intellectual engagement. What about your career? Bradley asked. I want to do more than modeling. I want to build something meaningful. Like what? I've been researching business development, maybe consulting or marketing strategy. Bradley recognized the language and ambition patterns. Anastasia was beginning to want the same kind of intellectual stimulation and professional recognition that had characterized his marriage to Keisha. But unlike Keisha, Anastasia lacked the educational foundation, cultural intelligence, and strategic thinking skills necessary for building a consulting business. Consulting is very competitive, Bradley said carefully. I know. But I think I understand fashion and beauty markets in ways that could help companies reach younger demographics. It was a reasonable idea, but Bradley could see the fundamental limitations in Anastasia's approach. Where Keisha understood cultural complexity, historical context, and strategic market positioning, Anastasia saw business opportunities through the lens of aesthetic appeal and social media engagement. Maybe you should start with some business courses, Bradley suggested. I don't need courses, Anastasia replied with defensiveness that suggested she'd interpreted his suggestion as condescension. I need opportunities. The conversation continued for another hour, but Bradley found himself making unconscious comparisons between Anastasia's business aspirations and Keisha's strategic brilliance. The comparison was unfavorable in ways that made him question not just his partner choice, but his ability to recognize and appreciate intellectual compatibility. You don't think I'm smart enough? Anastasia said finally. That's not what I said. You don't have to say it. I can see how you look at me when I talk about business. She was right. Bradley had been unconsciously evaluating Anastasia's intellectual capacity against Keisha's analytical sophistication, and the comparison highlighted limitations that made their relationship feel superficial rather than substantive. I think you're intelligent, Bradley said. But business consulting requires specific skills and experience that take time to develop. Your ex-wife didn't start with business consulting, Anastasia pointed out. She built it from cultural knowledge. Cultural knowledge. Even Anastasia understood the foundation of Keisha's success better than Bradley had appreciated during their marriage. That's different, Bradley said. Why? Because she's black and I'm white? Because she understood culture and I just understand fashion. The questions were more perceptive than Bradley had expected. Anastasia was recognizing that Keisha's cultural intelligence had been a strategic advantage rather than simply personal background, and that her own cultural identity as a white European model provided different but potentially valuable market insights. "It's not about race," Bradley said, but his tone suggested uncertainty. "Isn't it?" Anastasia asked. "You married a brilliant black woman, used her insights to build your business, then left her for a beautiful white woman who made you feel successful without challenging you to be better." The analysis was devastatingly accurate. Anastasia had identified the racial and intellectual dynamics that Bradley had been unwilling to acknowledge even to himself. "That's not what happened," Bradley protested. "That's exactly what happened," Anastasia replied. "And now she's more successful than you ever were, while you're stuck with someone you think is too simple to build a real business." The conversation ended with Anastasia retreating to their bedroom and Bradley remaining at the restaurant, processing accusations that felt uncomfortably close to psychological insights he'd been avoiding for 3 years. 6 months later, Anastasia ended their relationship with a farewell note that read like a business strategy memo. "I deserve a partner who sees my potential rather than my limitations. Good luck with your uncomplicated life." She moved to New York, where she launched a fashion consulting business that specialized in helping luxury brands reach Eastern European markets. The business was successful enough to generate coverage in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, articles that positioned Anastasia as an expert on international fashion marketing and cultural intelligence. Even his simple girlfriend had achieved something more intellectually ambitious than their relationship had allowed. Bradley found himself alone in the Pacific Heights penthouse he'd shared with 2 different women who had both outgrown their relationships with him by building businesses that reflected their authentic capabilities rather than his limited expectations. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Bradley Harrison had a talent for attracting brilliant women and systematically underestimating their potential until they moved beyond his ability to understand or support their success. And now Keisha Williams was about to deliver the final lesson in power dynamics that Bradley Harrison would never forget. So what do you think? Did Keisha plan this perfectly, or was it just karma doing its work? Because this story has one more twist that will leave you speechless. 3 months after Anastasia's departure, Bradley Harrison received an invitation that would complete his education in power, humility, and the consequences of underestimating brilliant women. The invitation was printed on heavy cream paper with embossed lettering that suggested importance without ostentation. Strategic Cultural Solutions requests the honor of your presence at the inaugural Global Cultural Intelligence Summit, featuring keynote presentations from international business leaders who have transformed their organizations through authentic diversity strategy. The summit was being held at the Moscone Center in San Francisco, Bradley's hometown, in a venue where he'd attended dozens of tech conferences and industry networking events. But this time he would be attending as audience rather than presenter, seeking insights rather than sharing expertise. The invitation continued. "This exclusive gathering will showcase case studies of successful cultural intelligence implementation, featuring presentations from CEOs, international investors, and strategic partners who have achieved measurable growth through authentic cultural competency." At the bottom of the invitation in elegant script, "Hosted by Keisha Williams, founder and CEO, Strategic Cultural Solutions." Bradley stared at the invitation for several minutes, processing its implications. Keisha was hosting a major industry conference in his city, featuring exactly the kind of business leaders he'd spent years trying to access. She was positioning herself as the definitive expert on topics that had once been collaborative conversations during their marriage. "Are you planning to attend?" his assistant asked when she noticed the invitation on his desk. "I don't know," Bradley replied honestly. But curiosity eventually overcame pride. 3 weeks later, Bradley found himself walking into Moscone Center's main auditorium, which had been configured for 800 guests representing major corporations, consulting firms, and business publications. The demographic composition of the audience was notably different from typical Silicon Valley conferences. Instead of the predominantly white male attendance that characterized most tech industry events, the summit featured significant representation from women, people of color, and international business leaders whose presence suggested global rather than regional relevance. Bradley took a seat in the middle section, hoping to observe without being noticed. But as the auditorium filled with guests, he began recognizing faces from Monaco, business magazines, and international news coverage. This wasn't simply a diversity consulting conference. It was a gathering of global business leaders seeking competitive advantages through cultural intelligence. The presentation began with a video montage showcasing strategic cultural solutions, international expansion, and client success stories. Companies that had increased revenue by 200 to 400% after implementing Keisha's cultural intelligence strategies. International partnerships that had been facilitated through her understanding of cross-cultural business practices. Market expansion successes that had generated billions in additional revenue for multinational corporations. But when Keisha took the stage, Bradley's breath caught in recognition of how completely she had transformed since their divorce. She commanded the auditorium with natural authority, moving across the stage like someone accustomed to addressing audiences of global business leaders. Her presentation style was confident without being aggressive, substantive without being academic, engaging without being performative. Cultural intelligence isn't about diversity quotas or sensitivity training, Keisha began, her voice carrying clearly across the packed auditorium. It's about understanding that different communities make decisions differently, build trust differently, and respond to marketing differently. Companies that master cultural intelligence don't just avoid cultural mistakes, they unlock markets that their competitors can't access. For the next 45 minutes, Keisha delivered a masterclass in strategic thinking that made Bradley realize how much of her expertise he'd absorbed during their marriage without fully understanding its sophistication or value. She presented case studies of Fortune 500 companies that had failed catastrophically when they'd assumed global markets operated according to American consumer psychology. She demonstrated how cultural intelligence had enabled other companies to build authentic relationships with diverse global demographics that generated sustainable competitive advantages. But the most compelling section of her presentation focused on the business ROI of authentic cultural competency versus performative diversity initiatives. Performative diversity is expensive and temporary, Keisha explained. You spend money on initiatives that look good in annual reports but don't change business outcomes. Authentic cultural intelligence is profitable and sustainable. You invest in understanding how different communities actually make decisions, and that understanding becomes a competitive advantage that compounds over time. The presentation concluded with strategic cultural solutions expansion plans, operations in 24 international markets within 3 years, partnerships with multinational corporations seeking cultural fluency for global operations, and the development of cultural intelligence certification programs for business leaders worldwide. We're not just consulting, Keisha said as her presentation reached its climax. We're building the infrastructure for how global businesses will understand and engage diverse markets for the next generation. The applause was sustained and enthusiastic, suggesting an audience that had received insights they could immediately apply to their own business challenges. During the networking reception that followed, Bradley watched from a distance as Keisha moved through clusters of international business leaders who were clearly seeking her guidance, partnership opportunities, and strategic insights. She was no longer someone seeking access to exclusive networks. She was someone that exclusive networks sought to access. Bradley Harrison? Bradley turned to find Marcus Webb, the cryptocurrency investor who had introduced him to Anastasia 3 years earlier. Marcus, Bradley replied. How are you? Good. Interesting conference. Your ex-wife has built something remarkable. Yes, she has. I heard you and the Russian model broke up. We did. Marcus nodded sympathetically, but his attention was already shifting toward the clusters of international investors surrounding Keisha. I should network, Marcus said. Great seeing you. He walked away without suggesting they continue their conversation, leaving Bradley alone in a room full of global business leaders who were all more interested in what Keisha had built than what Bradley had achieved. Standing at the edge of the reception, watching his ex-wife command attention from some of the world's most successful business leaders, Bradley finally understood the complete scope of what he had lost and what she had gained. He hadn't just lost a brilliant wife. He had lost a strategic partner whose insights and cultural intelligence had been foundational to his business success. He had lost access to someone whose understanding of cultural dynamics could have transformed Harrison Tech into something globally significant. More importantly, he had lost the opportunity to support and be supported by someone whose capabilities extended far beyond what he'd been prepared to recognize or appreciate. Keisha had transformed her divorce from personal trauma into professional fuel, using Bradley's rejection as motivation to build something that made his own accomplishments appear modest by comparison. She had taken the cultural intelligence that Bradley had benefited from during their marriage and turned it into a global business empire that served multinational corporations seeking authentic competitive advantages. She had proven that the qualities Bradley had found complicated about their interracial relationship, cultural depth, strategic thinking, intellectual challenge, were actually the foundations of transformational business success. As the reception continued around him, Bradley made his way toward the exit, processing lessons that he was learning too late to benefit from personally. On his way out, he passed a display showcasing Strategic Cultural Solutions' recent client testimonials. One quote caught his attention. "Keisha Williams taught us that diversity isn't charity, it's competitive intelligence. Companies that understand cultural complexity will dominate the global markets. Companies that don't will be left behind." CEO, Fortune 50 Technology Corporation. Competitive intelligence. It was exactly what Bradley had possessed during his marriage to Keisha and exactly what he'd lost when he chose simplicity over sophistication. 6 months later, Harrison Tech Solutions was acquired by a larger enterprise software company for a price that was respectable but unremarkable. Bradley remained with the acquiring company as a senior director, managing enterprise accounts in predominantly white corporate markets. Strategic Cultural Solutions went public 18 months later with an IPO valuation of $2.8 billion, making Keisha Williams one of the wealthiest black women in global business. Forbes featured her on their cover with the headline, "The Cultural Intelligence Revolution: How One Woman Built a Global Empire from Authentic Diversity." The article's opening paragraph read, "When Keisha Williams was divorced by her tech executive husband, she could have been bitter. Instead, she got strategic. 3 years later, she's transformed cultural intelligence from a consulting specialty into a global competitive advantage that multinational corporations pay billions to access." Bradley read the article in his new apartment, smaller than the penthouse he'd shared with Anastasia, quieter than the home he'd built with Keisha, and perfectly suited for a man who had learned too late that some opportunities only come once. The final lesson of Bradley Harrison's education in power dynamics was simple but profound. Brilliant women will find ways to be brilliant, with or without partners who understand their worth. The choice is whether you support their brilliance or become a cautionary tale about the men who let greatness slip away. Have you ever had someone underestimate you because of your race, gender, or background? Have you ever had to choose between love and family loyalty? Did you think their revenge was justified, or should Keisha have taken a different path? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to hear that the best revenge is always building something so successful that your doubters become case studies in their own limitations. If this story moved you, inspired you, or just left you saying karma is beautiful, then you know exactly what to do with that subscribe button. We've got more stories about love, betrayal, and ultimate comebacks coming your way every week. And remember, never let anyone make you feel like you're not worthy of the VIP section of life. Sometimes you have to build your own empire to prove that you belong there all along. Until next time, keep rising, keep shining, and never let anyone dim your light for their comfort. Because the world needs your brilliance, whether they're ready to acknowledge it or not.
Thanks for watching!